This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Gluck Plumbing. For all your plumbing service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call at 732-523-1836, extension 1. If anyone would like to support the podcast, to sponsor an episode, or for any questions, comments, or general feedback, please check out the website, seforim or email me.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Yaakov Taubes, who is the rabbi of the Mount Sinai Jewish Center in Washington Heights and a doctoral candidate in medieval Jewish history at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. And we will be discussing Rabeinu Bachya, or Rabeinu Bachya, depending on how people know him, for his famous, important Pirish commentary on Chumash, as well as his other seforim, which are HaKemach, Shulchan, Shel, Arba, and Pirkei, Avos. So thank you, first of all, Rabbi Yaakov, for joining me.
Thank you so much. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been a long-time listener of the podcast, so it's very special to be here with you now.
Okay, so let's start off a little bit about tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, in a rabbinic home, so really surrounded by seforim. My father has a very large seforim library, so I was always grew up with that kind of influence. I studied in Israel, Yeshiva Keren B'Yavneh for a few years, and then I came to YU, where I got my BA and my MA in Jewish studies, and also my smicha. And I started my doctoral program there in PhD in medieval Jewish history. Then I moved to Philadelphia, where I was the rabbi at the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, for 5 years. While there, I did a big chunk of my graduate work, of my coursework, studied with some of the professors there. And then I moved back to New York City, back to the Heights, where I became the rabbi at Mount Sinai Jewish Center. And I'm also an assistant director at REITs, at Yeshiva Rabeinu Bachya in the Smicha program, and still working on my PhD.
Okay, very nice. So let's jump right into Rabeinu Bachya or Bachya. I guess we'll get to his name in a minute. I mean, how did you get interested in him, or in just in general to medieval Jewish history?
Yeah, I was always a big history fan. I liked reading American history when I was younger, and eventually I discovered what Jewish history was. I started reading very extensively in that area. The first time I remember reading Rabeinu Bachya and being really enamored with it was when I was in yeshiva. I still remember it was Rabeinu Bachya at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, how he explains the Malach, or whatever the guide of the Jewish people there. He starts talking about that. I was so taken by the commentary. Fast forward a couple of years, I was working on a different project about the connection between truth and faith. Emes ve'emunah is what I had called it. And I came across Rabeinu Bachya's entry in the HaKemach for emunah. And I maybe had heard of the work, but I never really understood it. And going through it and seeing how it was alphabetically organized, that just fascinated me, that a medieval work of the Rishonim was organized up Aleph Beis. I wasn't aware that any works had done that besides dictionaries. And that began this kind of fascination with his style and how he collected things and organization. And that's just how I just got into him, and been learning it ever since.
Okay, so let's start off right away, right in the beginning, with his name. This is like an issue. I told you before we started recording in Yeshiva, it seems like the way that the people decided was that it's Rabeinu I think the Chovos HaLevavos right is Rabeinu Bachya in Pekuda, and he's Rabeinu Bachya. Oh, maybe I messed that one up. He's Rabeinu Bachya. One of them is Rabeinu Bachya, and one of them is Bachya. So I don't know where that came from, if that has any accuracy or not. So what's with the name a little bit? Also, he's called Rabeinu, which is interesting.
Yeah, so the way I sometimes like when people ask me about it, if you're writing an encyclopedia article about him, you would start with some sentence, you're writing the Wikipedia page, let's say, it'd be Rabeinu Bachya ben Asher was a dayan and a preacher in Saragossa in Spain in the 13th century. Something like that. Almost every word in that sentence is subject to some question, including his name. So why he's called Rabeinu as opposed to Rabbi or anyone else, I admit I don't have a great explanation for. I've never seen anything definitive on that. What is name? What is Bachya? What is Bachya? It has to. What kind of name is that in the first place? So if you look through the scholarship and people have written about this, you can find at least 4 different ways to pronounce the name, or at least the ones that I'm aware of. Some say the Bachya. That's what they kind of do in the yeshivas. The earlier Rabeinu Bachya, which we'll talk about him in a minute, Bachya in Pekuda, the author of Chovos HaLevavos, lived about 200 years before the one about Rabeinu Bachya we're talking about tonight, is usually known as Bachya. And this one is often called in yeshivas Bachya. I guess because B'chai means life, and we say in Kaddish, B'chai Yechon of Yom Echon, B'chai Dechol Beis Yisrael. So somehow when you see the letters Beis Ches Yud Yud, there's an automatic assumption to go there. It's possible that's the name. It's very unlikely. Most people reject that as accurate pronunciation. Probably the way that one developed was where you have to distinguish the same way with you have Rambam and Ramban, where you put the emphasis is a good way of distinguishing. So you don't have to the nun and the mem at the end. So probably that's how that one developed. You had to have a way of explaining the difference or pointing out the difference between the two of them was you pronounce it differently. B'chai is often used, is probably not accurate. Another possible one is Rabeinu Bachya. This was preferred by Professor Mor Steinschneider, the great encyclopedist. He really thought Bachya was correct. He didn't actually think it was 100% correct. He thought it was the best one that we could find. He thought it was Bachya. And wherever he had a chance, he would mention for both Bachyas, both the Rabeinu Bachya and Bekuda and Ben Usher, he would always point out it's Bachya. To the point, though, there was an English translation. Most of his works are in German. So he wrote like a dictionary of sorts of Spanish authors, medieval Spanish authors. And in his dictionary, he put it Bachya, but when they're translating into English, they actually had to mess with the order because they wanted to put it in as Bachya because they wanted to keep with the scholarly consensus and not do Bachya. So they had to put a note there. He does it Bachya, but we're doing it differently to maintain, it gets complicated. Others maintained it was Bachi, which is short for Bachiel. There's a Portuguese name, Bachiel. So that's how some insist that the pronunciation is supposed to be, some Bachi or some version thereof. Or the most common one, at least in the scholarly world, is Bachya. Some assume it's perhaps a combination names Ibn Yahya became Bachya. That does happen sometimes that a double yud at the end of the name is where we would put a hey or an aleph. A double yud at the end kind of accomplishes that. You have that with some Arabic names, with some Spanish names as well. People know Gedalia ibn Yahya. They may know that name. One of the Rishonim, late Rishonim, really Achronim. We know that's the name, so it could be Bachya is some combination of that. What does it mean? Where does it come from? Maybe it's connected to Chaim for life. Maybe it's Bachiel. Maybe it's that Ibn Yahya. It's really not clear where it came from. The other question that we could ask is, do we have anyone else with that name? How many Bachas do we know? So this actually may relate to where he's from. I mentioned, but he's traditionally said he's from Saragossa. That's usually where most people say, encyclopedia article will say that he lived in Saragossa in Spain. Where is this based on? So there are most people, if you don't know, there's at least three Rabeinu Bachyas. There's the two that we mentioned so far. Rabeinu Bachya in Bekuda, who's the author of the Chovos Levavos, and Rabeinu Bachya ben Usher, the author of the commentary on the Torah. There is a third Rabeinu Bachya, ben Moshe, that we know of. He was very active in the Maimonidean controversy. He wrote a letter in support of the Rambam. Again, after Rambam died, when the controversy sprung up again, there was a Bachya Moshe who was from Saragossa. We actually have a letter that he wrote in support of the Rambam's works. That's another Bachya who actually lived in Saragossa. So fast forward a little bit of time later on, there you'll find in the work Shalshelas HaKabbalah, it mentions that Rabeinu Bachya ben Usher was from Saragossa. But there's reason to believe that he confused the two Bachyas. He confused our Rabeinu Bachya ben Usher with the Bachya ben Moshe. What makes that funny, if he's accurate, and I think there's good reason that is correct, that is a mistake, most people think that Bachya and Bekuda also lived in Saragossa. So where does that come from? Well, the first critical edition of the Chovos Levavos, which came out in the 19th century, the editor writes, well, since the other two Bachyas are from Saragossa, probably Bachya and Bekuda was also from Saragossa. But the whole thing's one big racket in that sense, if I can call it that, well, since we know one Bachya was from there, probably the second one was from there. Well, if the second one was from there, the first one, it must be even the third one was from there. So it's kind of funny how these things develop. There's no indication either Bachya lived in Saragossa, except, and I mentioned as an aside, I once saw a very scholarly edition of the Chovos Levavos, which had a whole introductory chapter explaining the philosophical cultural currents that were going on in Saragossa during that time. To me, it was a little bit funny because how do you know he lived in Saragossa? It's a little, do you have any proof of that? It's funny to say, this was the influence, this was his cultural milieu. How do you know he even lived there? I, in my own research, have found I'm really trying to find the origin of the name. I have found 4 other Bachyas from the Midi Rishonim period. There's a tshuva of the Rivash, who mentions a doctor Bachya, who he has a tshuva involving. We have a poem which mentions a Bachya that spells out in the acrostic Bachya. And there's one other one mentioned in a manuscript, another Bachya. All of them lived in Saragossa. So there's at least what we call circumstantial evidence that Bachya was a popular name in Saragossa, to the point that say, well, maybe we can say all the Bachyas lived in Saragossa, or at least they were born there. Was he actually active there? Did he live there? It's very, very hard to say.
Right. Okay, so let's start off talking about him when he was born, what we know of where he lived and who he studied under. I mean, he learned under the Rajba, right? So the Rajba was in Barcelona, which was near Saragossa, so maybe he wasn't Saragossa. But you can maybe mention some of that geography. But anyways, let's start off with his basic background.
Okay, so again, we know almost nothing about him. As I mentioned earlier in that sentence, we know that is, so even that his name was Bachya. So I mentioned this. So his name was Bachya. We all know that. Rabeinu Margaliot Zatzal is a great scholar, librarian, Talmud Chacham, found a manuscript which is now you can see it online with the Wonders of Ketiv, for the National Library project of digitizing manuscripts. You can actually see the manuscript online. There is a Spanish manuscript of his commentary that says Rabeinu Bachya that his real name was Yehuda. So maybe his name was Yehuda Bachya, was just a nickname. Reuven Margoliot published this in Sinai, in the journal Sinai, and then in the following journal, someone wrote a letter back, and that, Yehuda and Bachya both have the same gematria, so perhaps that's why the name got switched from one. Okay, could be. It's hard to know what to do with that. No one else refers him to Rabeinu Yehuda anywhere else. So it's very hard to know. Was that actually his name? Again, there is this manuscript evidence. You can't totally ignore it, but it is one manuscript that makes that claim. So it's hard to know. That his father was named Usher is also subject to question, because in one place in his commentary, he quotes something, B'Shem Aleph Aleph Nasan. So Aleph Aleph is usually Adoni Avi, my father, my master. So maybe his father's name was Nasan. And some say, yeah, his name was Nasan. If you look in the front, it's Rabeinu Bachya Asher Nasan. And so so they kind of play with the words. So maybe the Usher is really Ben. So it's Ben Nun is really Rashi Table is Ben Nasan Asher. No. That's how someone wanted to read that. Not everyone accepts that. It could more likely the Aleph is Avi, my grandfather, Avi Imi, my grandfather. But again, we don't really know for sure. In terms of where he lived, again, we know he was in Spain. He spoke Arabic fluently. He could read Arabic. We'll get to this a little bit later. But this is not everyone in Christian Spain during this time period. Remember, we're in the time that the Christians control the main part of Spain where the Jewish community lives. Most Jews at that point were not reading Arabic. The Ramban probably did not read too much Arabic, if at all. Rabeinu Bachya could read Arabic fluently. He translated Arabic works. Does that suggest that maybe he had some family origins in southern Spain? Again, hard to know. Maybe just parents taught it to him, but we don't know too much about his upbringing. His main Rebbe was certainly the Rashba. He quotes him all the time, and some of what he quotes we have found corroborations in the Rashba's Chuvos and Rashba's writings elsewhere. I think there has to be a little bit of, whenever we say someone was a student of the Rashba, you can very easily get into anachronism. What does it mean he was his Talmud? The Rashba was the Gadol Ador of the time, you might say. He was the leading posek in all of Spain. Thousands of chuvas of his survived, and probably many more that didn't survive. He was the Rav, the Gadol of the time. Many people who were his students, we don't know if they sat in shir and yeshiva with him. It seems like every year they publish a new sefer that's the ksavim of Talmud HaRashba. Rav Shefter Shlita from Hawaii likes to joke sometimes, the Rashba also might have had Talmidim that slept in the back of the room, just because you're in the area of Yisham doesn't make you Rishon. So was every person a student, they were all sitting in yeshiva with him? Or perhaps he was the Gadol Ador and people heard when he came to town, he gave a shir, or people knew of his psukim. So when it says he was the student of the Rashba, It's hard to know. Does that mean he actually sat at the Raglav Ben Raglav of the Rashba Shlomo Adaris and learned by him, or just was aware of his Torah? There's a sefer, and we can talk about this later, of Rabbi Yaakov Sicily. There's a sefer called the Torah Semincha, among others. And a new edition came out. It doesn't even say his name on the cover. It just says Torah Semincha Mitalmud Rashba. The Rashba died when Yaakov Sicily was maybe 18 years old. Again, it's possible he learned by him. I don't want to take away that, but that he quotes the Rashba as Rebbe doesn't mean he actually learned by him. So it's hard to know what their relationship was. There are only tshuvas between them, as far as I've been able to find. So, but certainly the most commonly quoted Rav in his tshuvas is indeed the Rashba. He also quotes Rabeinu Dan Ashkenazi, who we know from some other places, quoted in the Mordechai, somewhat of a controversial figure in Spain. Him and the Rashba clashed on a few things. He quotes, that's another one of his Rebbeim that he refers to. Again, the Rashba was in Barcelona, so some have assumed that Bachya also must have spent time there, but this is all very, very much conjecture. In terms of other things, his background, we don't know any formal rabbinic position that he had. He's often called Hadayan, a judge. It is very possible that is being mixed up with Rebachya Ibn Bakuda, who we know is a Dayan. I have found already in the Rishonim, one of the late Rishonim, we'll mention him later, of Shemot Ibn Shaprut, refers to him as a Dayan. But again, it could be there's confusion there. And that he was a darshan, that he was a preacher. He's certainly someone who gave drushos, because we'll talk about that later. We have some of his drushos that he gave, or the work of his drushos. Does that mean he had a formal rabbinic role? We just don't know. We have no mention that he was a rav in the community, or other than the fact that he was giving drushos. So we don't really know too much about him. The official years are usually given 1255 to 1340. Not clear what that's based on. It's mentioned in some other sources. We don't have any record of when he died. He mentions that he completed the commentary in 1291. He does write that in his commentary twice. Actually, he mentions it in Bereshis, and then again, Re'eh, he records that he finished commentary in 1291. Some have questioned, could he really have written this entire commentary in 1 year? Or maybe he edited the text later to make it consistent? Not so sure. It could be, he's very talented. Maybe he wrote the whole thing in 1 year. But beyond that, we do not have set dates for anything. We don't know about his wife. We don't know about his children. Just this past week, I found the reference that he had a grandson. But this is recorded much later, that someone reported that his grandson wrote we have a commentary on Shir Hashirim from someone who later on was claimed to be his grandson. That is the first family reference I've been able to find. The last thing I'll mention about his background that we do know, he's often recorded in the published editions as Ibn Chalawa. That's often Rabeinu Bachya ben Asher Ibn Chalawa. Chevel's edition, I think, doesn't have that, but many of the early printed editions say Rabeinu Bachya ben Asher Ibn Chalawa, and I was trying to verify that. So the two places that I've been able to verify is, number one, the aforementioned, I just mentioned a few moments ago, this commentary on Shir Hashirim by someone who was supposed to be a grandson of his was named Ibn Chalawa. So that would report that it was the same person. But even better, some of your listeners may know of the Maram Chalawa, a very important commentary on Mesach Pesachim. You studied in Yeshiva on Pesachim. His son wrote a commentary on the Torah called Rish Shefer that was published a few years ago, I think, by Machon Yerushalayim, I think. So he quotes Rabeinu Bachya at one point, and he says, Krovenu. He quotes, B'Shem Krovenu, our relative, Rabeinu Bachya ben Asher. That to me is proof, and I've actually was able to get a copy of the original manuscript as well of that work, and that is in the original manuscript. It says Krovenu, so that would indicate again that Rabeinu Bachya was a member of the Chalawa family, the Ram Chalawa. Beyond that, and it sounds like a lot, but that's just really, these are kind of little details here and there. We know almost nothing else about him, where he traveled. We don't have tshuvos, we don't have letters to him, we don't know who he interacted with. That's really all we know about him.
Okay, so I'll throw into Imre Shefer, Rabbi Yehuda Chalawa, as you said, or maybe people are familiar as Chalavad, I think the name is. But so it was published by Mechonor of Hirschler. It looks like he wrote Tafshin Nun Gimel, so I guess a while ago already. It's just on Bereshis also, right? And it's not. Yeah,
the manuscript, we don't have more than that in the manuscript.
Yeah, I found it. I don't know that it's available anymore, but maybe it is. So that is
it's on Otzar HaChachma. You can get it there.
There you go. Okay, so let's talk about the Rabeinu Bachya, his commentary on Chumash. Obviously, this is an extremely famous commentary on Chumash. So, I mean, talk about the I'm not sure how we should go about this. Let's first talk about, before we get into the actual commentary, you can get to this, as you answer this question throughout it. But what's the background of it, and of when, the actual commentary, and then when it was printed, its printing history, and then also, something else I think it's very important is how it became so famous. I was mentioning this to you before we started recording, how this is one of the most popular commentaries, I think, especially for the Rishonim throughout the centuries. Maybe not as much today anymore, although it's quoted a lot, but like people learning it, I don't know, I could be wrong on this, but it doesn't seem to me like that, but as much anymore. But anyways, this is from the most famous commentaries. So yeah.
Yeah, his commentary to a certain extent is certainly based on the Ramban. And the Ramban was, I guess, his style for writing a commentary. We take it for granted that a good commentary will engage with earlier sources. And the way I think Moshe Habertal in his recent biography of the Ramban, that the Ramban brought the Balei Tosfos method into the commentary on the Torah, where you quote and you quote a raya against, and you a little shaklatataria, a little back and forth. Rabeinu Bachya is certainly following in that tradition. The Ramban really set up for all time, and his commentary is similar in that sense. And again, people will read it next to each other. Often Bachya will expand upon a point in the Ramban. What the key feature of Rabeinu Bachya's commentary, both in how it's known and also how Rabbi Bachya himself presents it in the Hakdama, is interpreting the Torah according to 4 drachim, 4 different paths. I want to avoid saying Pardes. Pardes is one of those, people may know, the Pardes is acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. It's one of these ideas that is very tantalizing. It is maybe good for teaching people about different styles of Torah commentary, is not accurate when talking about the Rishonim. The Pardes, that term is used in a particular Zoharic passage, meaning a very particular thing there, and was really picked up later on in time as a derech, as you explain the pasuk according to Pardes. Every so often, the forums on Facebook and blogs that people post, what are good examples for Rishonim of Pardes? There aren't any, because that wasn't a term they used or a style they used. So I'm intentionally avoiding using that. But Rabeinu Bachya did say he's going to Hakdama in his introduction. I'm going to explain the Pesukim according to 4 methods. These are Pshat, and he indicates Rashi particularly as will be his one for Pshat, but not exclusively. And then Medrash, by which he means both Gemara and the typical Midrashim. I'm sorry, my Medrash utilizing Midrashim, and he had a wide collection of Midrashim that we don't have anymore. Some Midrashim we do have. He was a big fan of what we call the Tanchuma, but tons of Midrashim. I mean, you can list, Chevelle can list them at some point, dozens and dozens. His access to Midrashim was quite extensive. Also, sometimes used Derech Medrash when it's his own idea, but it kind of takes it out of the Pesukim, where kind of the Pesukim are indicating something and nothing to do with Pshat. Sometimes his own interpretation will be there. And then Kabbalah, where very often if you don't understand the Ramban, because the Ramban is intentionally being very cryptic and short on words, Rabeinu Bachya will often extend. He also sometimes chooses to not totally reveal what's going on, but very often he'll be more wordy than the Ramban. So the particular Kabbalistic idea that you want to understand more about, often Rabeinu Bachya does give that explanation. And the 4th way is Derech HaSeichel, which is philosophy. Philosophy here it's not a perfect translation, but that can mean the sciences, that can medicine, actual philosophy. Sometimes it can mean what's often called topology, or it's referring to something else in the future. Seichel is kind of a catch-all for methods often called the Mor Nevuchim, and other philosophers in that method. It must be said he only actually uses all 4 methods on the same pasuk, maybe I think 15 times in the entire commentary. This is not something he's doing systematically on every single pasuk. He's going to quote all 4 methods. He really does that very few times. I may will mention an example in a moment, but he does not do that so many times throughout the commentary. The way I think to understand what Rabeinu Bachya was trying to do with his commentary, we have to understand the historical background of what's going on in Spain right now. Spain at this point, let's say the late 13th century, the late 1200s, was a time of an ingathering of Jews from all over the Jewish world. We know the Jews had been expelled from France a number of times, but many of them were coming into Spain at this point. We know the situation in Germany, was getting bad. Eventually, the rush, as we know, Rabbeinu Asher and his family would go. I meant the aforementioned of Dan Ashkenazi, one of his Rebbeim was from Germany who had left because it's hard times there. Things where Jews had been expelled from England. Italy was getting complicated. Provence. Spain was really at this point an ingathering of Jews from all over the world. And therefore you had, I don't know so much a clash, but you had traditions, particularly of how to interpret the psukim from all these different areas. And what Rabeinu Bachya was trying to do was offer the reader, offer the student a carefully curated and edited selection of commentaries where you could see, oh, you want this pshat here, and I'm going to go for the best pshat approach. But sometimes it's the best medrash approach. But sometimes something good in Kabbalah, sometimes good in philosophy. We often see Kabbalah and philosophy as contradicting each other, as opposed to each other. At this point, the Rambam and his philosophical methods were very popular, were very mainstream, and what we would become the Zohar. But what was called at that point the Kabbalistic methods were also very mainstream. And Rabeinu Bachya didn't see a contradiction in quoting both. There's no question his allegiance lay with Kabbalah. He has some disparaging things about philosophy here and there. It's very clear he saw the true secrets of the Torah as being revealed in Kabbalah. There's no question about that. But he saw the value in looking at all these traditions that came before him, all these different interpretive methods that were before him, and he's going to offer the best of them with the hand of an editor. He doesn't very rarely quotes verbatim, will often add a word or two that will add a level of explanation. Very often does in the Ramban. He'll say Zeshel, sometimes in Chevel's edition, he'll put in brackets where Rabeinu Bachya quotes the Ramban. And you may have I admit I sometimes have it, okay, I'll just skip it, I'll look it up in the Ramban. But Rabeinu Bachya adds some key words to make it more explainable, to avoid some problems. And I think the best way, if I can use like a modern example, is think of something like the Art Scroll Stone Chumash or other anthologies that you may be aware of. Rabeinu Bachya was creating an anthology commentary. Remember, this is before the Mikros Gedolos, obviously, where people could see the text in the original. And he wants to offer an anthologized commentary where he could offer you almost everything. And to answer your question about why it was so popular, that is the secret of its popularity for most of history. Because it was, it's not in a, Chas V'Shalom and disparaging way. It was a one-stop shop. It was a one place where you could go and get the best of all the traditions and all the different approach of commentaries that had come before him.
Okay, so another thing about the Chumash. So there's two things. There's the style, and we can discuss a little bit more of what you mentioned. Maybe let's talk about that first. You mentioned about Kabbalah and Zohar that he quotes, and as well as Seichel, secular knowledge. He has some interesting secular knowledge and sources. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe you have some examples of that.
So there are two places in the commentary where he quotes what he calls Medrash of Shimon Bar Yochai. That is what we call nowadays the Zohar. And match up the passages. There are other places in the commentary where he quotes Al Derech HaKabbalah, Derech Sodar, Derech Kabbalah is indeed from the Zohar. And Shel has noted in a few places. Ephraim Gottlieb, who was a great scholar, Rabeinu Bachya, wrote an important work called the Kabbalah B'Kisei Rabeinu Bachya Ben Asher, and he's really done this much more systematically than anyone else. It is assumed that some early version of what would later become the Zohar was floating around during this time, and already floating. Rabeinu Bachya had access to it, and he's quoting that. Again, it's hard to know. Sometimes people like to ask, who is his Rebbe in Nister? That's a question I've been asked before. Who taught Rabeinu Bachya Kabbalah? It's hard to know if people saw it that way, that you went to a specific Rebbe to learn Kabbalah like we think nowadays. So it's hard to, again, since we know so little about him, where he got these ideas from. Again, he was certainly in that world of the Ramban and the Rashba. The Rashba we don't have too much Kabbalah from. The Rashba would eventually put a ban on philosophy, as we know, but that was later. That was after the commentary was published. So where does Rabeinu Bachya fit into that? It's, again, very difficult to know. In terms of philosophical commentaries that he quotes, or philosophical works that he quotes Aristotle a few times, and he quotes Galen. He translated Galen, medical text. He quotes Averroes, and then just sometimes without naming, he'll mention astronomy, astrology, and other philosophers. He has a whole philosophical or whatever you want to call derech haseichel approach to the stones of the Choshen. This has received an interesting amount of scholarship of what each stone, the power of each stone on the Choshen, and what gets a very long piece there, and he's trying to explain what each one affected and how its connection to each shevet was. This was something that was of interest to him.
Now, another thing about it is something else is interesting is Mefarshim that he quotes, especially Rabeinu Hananel, the Rach, is one that he quotes extensively that we don't have anymore. There's perhaps others who talk about the other Mefarshim he quotes.
Yeah, Rabeinu Hananel is an interesting one. The Shel edition of the Pirush Rabeinu Hananel that they print in the Torah's Chaim Chumash, Shel put that together, is mostly 75% maybe based on citations from Rabeinu Bachya ben Asher's commentary on the Torah. One fascinating one again worth looking into is in Parshas Bo by Chodesh Zelachem, by the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Rabeinu Hananel had a shita that may come from Rav Sajagon, where he held contrary. We always think, based on the Rambam, that the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh is to go out and to see the moon, and if you see the moon appear, and then you go to Beis Din, that the real mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh is what we now call the cheshbon, for Beis Din to calculate what month and when it should fall out, and then afterward they said to find the moon because that would prove that the cheshbon was correct. But really, you didn't even need that. Which to us sounds almost like heretical. You grow up learning, of course, you see the moon and the sliver, it reappears, and Beis Din goes, Mekudesh. All right. Rabeinu Hananel, and our main source is Rabeinu Hananel Shita, comes from Rabeinu Bachya, a very long, extended piece, and he quotes the rayas back and forth, and goes through it fairly systematically. But we know this Rabeinu Hananel Shita based on Bachya's citation of him. Just one example of again Rabeinu Hananel's commentary, which we don't have, but we know from Bachya ben Asher. He quotes some Gaonim commentaries, Chafni Gaon, others that we don't really have. But again, tons of midrashim that's hard to know was works that have been lost over time.
Right, and this is together with the classic, like you said, Rajba, Ramban, and others.
Yeah, I mean, I could list, to list all the commentaries he writes. I'm happy to quickly run through some of them. I mean, just talk about. One second. Okay, but obviously you have Rashi, all time Ibn Ezra. Shmuel ibn Tibon, the Radak, the Ramban, Rabeinu Yonah is important to mention. Another key feature of the commentary is the beginning of each parsha. He offers introductory, what they call a prom, introductory drasha on the parsha. I mean, before he starts the commentary, he'll quote a pasuk, usually from Mishlei, not always, but usually from Mishlei, and he'll explain that pasuk, some Musar idea. In Hakdama, he mentions Al Derech HaMusar. This will be his fifth way of explaining the Pesukim. And then he'll quote interpretation of it, often based on Rabeinu Yonah. We have Rabeinu Yonah's commentary on Mishnah, so sometimes this matches, sometimes it doesn't. And then he'll kind of weave that into an introduction to the Parsha. And he'll kind of conclude with the opening verse of the Parsha. Very Medrash Rabbah style, for those who have studied that. We're starting with a pasuk that's not connected to the subject matter and ending with a pasuk that leads right in to the Parsha. He does that at the beginning of every Parsha. One of the ways, actually, some readers may know, some listeners may know, that the Parsha breakdown that we have nowadays is not identical to the one that is shown. There are some different customs of the Parsha breakdown. Mishpatim, for example, was divided into two in Spain. We know the Sefer HaKemach, for example, has two parshas, one called Mishpatim, one called Kesef Talva. Splitting Mishpatim into two parshas. It seems they would read that as two separate parshas in some kinds of years, or sometimes a double parsha. So Rabeinu Bachya, we actually know, held the same way, because although if you read the comment, you won't notice, because he has a separate midrasha in the middle. He just kind of in the middle opens up with a pasuk from Mishlei and then goes reads into him Kesef Talva. So he also obviously maintained that this was a separate parsha. It's actually a work I'm hoping to finish one day. One thing I'm trying to translate the opening prom to each parsha. It's these probably were drushes that he actually gave, and we'll talk about that later. But certainly felt these were drushos on each parsha, and often exploring some musar idea that you could learn from the parsha beyond just interpreting the words. Again, other commentaries that he mentions, again, really go on and on. Bachya Bekuda, I should mention, in case there was any doubt that he is the same as Bachya Bekuda, he quotes Rabeinu Bachya Bekuda, so definitely are not the same person. He quotes the Kuzari twice, Avram Barchia, the Rambam many times, both Sefer Mitzvos, Perish Mishnayos, Mor Nevuchim, Again, Midrashim, as I mentioned, galore. Again, Elazar Kalir. He quotes Josephus, Yosef Ben Gurion. You can go on and on with how many sources he quotes.
Okay, so now before we get on to before we finish the discussion about the Chumash commentary, obviously there's a lot more to discuss about it, but for this podcast episode, is that something interesting is, and perhaps if you have any other examples, you can throw them in at any time when you answer. But another thing would be the afterlife. What happened after? What kind of impact did this commentary have on others? Tzenorena, a famous commentary, quotes a lot of Rabeinu Bachya. I mean, there are others also that quoted him. So what kind of, and just perhaps, you mentioned this was the first anthology, perhaps it had, created others to create similar type of anthologies.
So his commentary was being published, being quoted rather, by people immediately after him, or in the same generation. Drush ibn Shweib, for example, quotes Rabeinu Bachya, even though they're more or less contemporaries, almost contemporaries. So he's already quoting him. I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Yaakov Sicily quotes him, and many others. And again, the son of the Ram Chalawa. So his commentary is already being cited rather widely among people of Shimon ibn Shaprut. They're already quoting him very shortly afterward. After the commentary was first written. Fast forward a little bit to the age of print. His commentary was published fairly early on the history of print. And among the libraries, we have a lot of records of the libraries, not a lot, we have records of the libraries of the Jews in Italy and other places. Rabeinu Bachya is one of the most commonly found commentaries, in some places even more than the Ramban. And I think the reason is it goes back to what we said earlier, I mentioned earlier, that it's an anthology. And so you have that one sefer. You don't have to have a copy of the Rashi and the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra and the Mor Nevuchim and all the other works you mentioned. You could just look at Rabeinu Bachya and trust that he gave you the best of those seforim and just have that. So his sefer was on everyone's shelf. It's again and again you see it coming up, and it's published a bunch of times in their days, which is again astounding considering how large it is. So that's just one place. And you mentioned the Tzenorena quotes it. He writes in the Hakdama that a lot of what he's basing on is from Rabeinu Bachya. Contrary to what's commonly thought nowadays, Tzenorena was not written as a sefer for women. That is certainly not, and it was not understood the way the Shulchan Aruch, of course, there records use Tzenorena for Shnai Mikra. So it's certainly not it was not understood to be a sefer for women. Think till later on. Although I saw one scholar claim that the Bachya in Bekudas Chovos Levavos was brought into the canon of acceptable Jewish works, despite its philosophical leanings, because people thought it was the same Rabeinu Bachya as for the commentary on the Torah, and they knew from the Tzenorena. So if that Rabeinu Bachya is good, well, it must be the Chovos Levavos is also good. Can't say if that's true or not, but I did see someone once make that claim. Among Jewish sources, the Chassam Sofer writes that he would read it every single Shabbos. I'm going out of order. The Ramah quotes his commentary in his explanation of Kiddush Levana of why we say David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, why we say that idea, why we mention that in Kiddush Levana. He quotes Rabeinu Bachya's interpretation that the moon is compared to a coronation. So when the king appears, everyone yells, "Long live the king!" And the connection to the Mashiach coming. So we're saying David Yisrael Chai V'Kayam when we see the moon. Again, the Ramah specifically, the Shulchan Aruch quotes that idea from Rabeinu Bachya, and he quotes Darkei Moshe quotes him in two other places. So he certainly was getting around. The commentary was getting around. Among the early Hasidic masters, Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, they were very into him. They quoted him a lot. There was a certain affinity towards many Hasidic masters. And then at some point, I don't exactly know why, his commentary kind of fell a little bit to disuse. It could be people start relying upon the Mikros Gedolos a lot more. And so, his commentary is too large to be printed in most Mikros Gedolos, although the Art Scroll recently, a couple of years ago now, published Art Scrolls, Mikros Gedolos, does include Rabeinu Bachya in there, which I thought was a nice restoring him to that position. But the standard Mikros Gedolos, including the Torah Chaim one, does not print it. And his commentary is a little bit longer for what most people perhaps are able to spend time on. And it could be that's why it's fallen a little bit out of use, even though I think most people have it on their shelves. The Art Scroll Chumash, for whatever it's worth, in their commentary, I'd say they quote Rabeinu Bachya at least once every 3 pages. So certainly his name gets around. But you have to be, if you're going to study him, you really have to be in it and looking at it carefully and reading carefully, because, he just quoted the Ramban, he just quoted earlier. But if you want to look at how he quotes them is a little bit different than how they say it, and how he's adding biurim, he's adding explanations. And then when he offers his own idea, you can find some very fascinating explanations. The other interesting aspect of the afterlife of Rabeinu Bachya's commentary is among Christian Hebraists. Christian Hebraists is a lot to talk about there, but this movement in the 15th, 16th, 17th century of Christians who were very interested in Jewish commentary, read Hebrew, and they were very, very interested in commentary, in Jewish commentary. And Rabeinu Bachya was a favorite of theirs. You'll find in almost all the Christian Hebraist libraries, and they'll often cite it. The reason being, for the same reason I think Jews liked it. You don't have to read through every single commentary that's out there. You want to know what the Jews say about this pasuk? Oh, let's look at Rabeinu Bachya. He'll quote everything. He'll quote the 5 different interpretations or 4 different drachim. He'll quote this one and that one, and we'll get everything we need to know. So it's just interesting that his name is coming up again and again there. I'll mention this in this vein. There is actually a Latin translation of Rabeinu Bachya's commentary on the Torah. It only goes through Sefer Vayikra. It was done by Conrad Pelikan, who translated many, many Jewish works. He talked about his autobiography, and only recently, a couple months ago, with the help of my friend Nidan Pinto in Israel, who's also doing some work on Rabeinu Bachya, we were actually able to get a copy of it from the University of Zurich, the library in Zurich. So again, it was never published before, but there is a Latin translation of Bachya's commentary to the Torah. He did translate many things, so I don't want to make too much emphasis on that, but certainly there was an interest among Hebraists to have this in Latin, so those who couldn't read Hebrew could also study it and get and find out, again, what the Jews were saying about a given pasuk.
So this Latin translation was published, or it's a manuscript?
Never published. It's a manuscript only. But going through it now, nothing. I haven't found so much interesting things there, but it's kind of wild that it exists, and again, still in manuscript.
Interesting. So first of all, you mentioned Senorena. That's not only for women. I will refer the listeners back to Dr. Morris Fairstein's podcast episode that I did, where he talks about this. He's written on Seforim blog about this. He has a new translation of Senorena where he says, very emphatic, it's not. And I think if you learn Senorena, you'll see it's really not. It's really people would actually be surprised what's in Senorena today if they found the English translation or the Hebrew one done on the first bridge. It's very interesting. It's not. It's clearly a real sefer with a lot of things quoted in it. One other thing, so you mentioned that's in the art scroll. Yeah, I think that's the whole thing. I seem to think it's in the Oz V'Hadar, Mercheves maybe. I could be wrong on this. I'm just saying this like from memory. I don't know. They have it Rabeinu Bachya just al derech hapshat in there maybe or something.
Yes, they have I think just the derech hapshat one in the back of the Oz V'Hadar. That is correct.
Yeah, I think it's in the Mercheves, the 7-volume only. I think it's not in the standard Oz V'Hadar Mercheves 5-volume course though.
There is also a mini Mikros Gedolos, and the publisher is escaping me now, where they printed along with the Gemaras that the Torah Tamima quotes without the Torah Tamima's commentary. I've seen such a Mikros Gedolos out there. So again, you can find it, but it's not in the standard. And again, it's certainly a longer commentary than your average, but it really can yield a tremendous thoroughness of ideas on a given pasuk.
Right, so that's what I would mention before we just finish up our discussion on the commentary. We go on to HaKemach, which I know is something you're really working on. Is that finally so there is the Masada of Cook 3-volume Shel one still around, the same old print. Sorry everyone, and then there's the Mir put one out. It's not Mir Yeshiva, it's Mir publishing out some sort of commentary, and Oz V'Hadar is in the middle of working on it. I think those are the main ones with the commentary. I don't know if you can speak to which one is the best or which one you can advise people to use, and then also, together with that, what would you, should someone, is Rabeinu Bachya something that you would advise to someone to pick up and to start learning on Chumash?
Yeah. So the Chevelle edition remains the standard edition. He did some script work, which is important, and he gives you all the citations from the Gemaras and the Midrashim and the Rishonim with some limited biurim. So certainly that edition is the edition that most people are using. So I think that's perfectly, that's what you have access to. The Mir edition, it did a nice job of it. I don't really added too much. For those who are familiar with the Oz V'Hadar, those who are Or Chaim, or the others are, I think, Ramban as well they've done, and there's one or two others that they're working on. If you're familiar with that style, it's the same style. They have a section where they just give you citations and comparisons to other Jewish works, other commentaries, and they have longer biurim at the bottom. If you're looking for a study aid alongside, Ozo did a nice job of it. They give you a lot. I think sometimes they go a little far from what Rabeinu Bachya was talking about. A lot of kind of comparing to other things that I'm not sure are totally where Bachya intended. But certainly, if you're looking just at something on the side to bolster what you're learning, I think it's good to have because it's not complete yet. Only again before I think it's only Bereshis, Shemos, and Devarim are out right now. Each of those 2 volumes each. Shemot, as of when I checked, Vayikra Midbar are not out yet. Hopefully, it'll be out soon. So there's that. Again, there's those editions. The art scroll, again, I think it's just a regular edition. I'm not sure which manuscript. So I don't think there's any manuscript work on that. In terms of other guides and resources, there is an English translation that's out there from Rabbi Monk. And it has been uploaded to Sefaria, so you can see it there. It wasn't particularly well edited, and they even write this in the hard copy. I think there's some page missing, some paragraphs missing. I would be careful about relying upon it. If you're not sure, given Word, you could check there, but I would not. I think twice before perhaps quoting that to someone else for checking the Hebrew. But again, it is up there on Sefaria, so it's incredibly accessible. There is a work called Sisrei Rabeinu Bachya, which collects multiple super commentaries that were written in Toras Chaim, not the Toras Chaim across the Dole, it's a different Toras Chaim, that were written to explain Rabeinu Bachya's Kabbalah. It's called Sisrei Rabeinu Bachya. I think it's still gettable. And I think they have a bunch of different Kabbalistic explanations of Rabeinu Bachya's Kabbalah. So if you're into the Kabbalah explanations, that can be helpful to you. And then there's the edition of the Iyunim from Rabeinu Bachya, published by Rabbi. So you were just holding it.
Rabbi Avram Lipschitz, yeah.
Thank you. From Osada of Cook. He has a very nice introduction and then a nice collection of ideas. It's sort of Al-Seder Parsha, but it's not meant to be learning pasuk by pasuk. It's kind of articles on different ideas in the parsha. So he did a very nice job. His research was very thorough and it's very well written. But if you're looking kind of a pasuk by pasuk guide, that's probably not what you're looking for. So again, I think if a person's looking for different commentaries, there certainly are other options. In terms of what you can get out of Rabeinu Bachya, as I said, sometimes he has interpretations that seem similar to the Ramban or similar to what you already know, but we look a little closer, there'll be something very often very rewarding. And I'll mention on Migdal Bavel because that's something that I've written about. He quotes a bunch of different explanations for what Migdal Bavel is. And what the purpose was based on Pshat, based on Medrash, and I'll give a shout out because I wrote an article about this that I published. In his Derech Seichel, he explains that the Migdal Bavel was to the purpose of this tall building. We have something on the top that would kind of, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu tried to bring a fire on the world, to bring lightning on the world, it would kind of catch the fire and the lightning and diffuse it over a area, which sounds a lot like a lightning rod. And there have been trends, there was other quotes that people thought, Rabeinu Bachya was aware of the lightning rod long before Benjamin Franklin did. Again, I wrote an article on the Lair House about it. I can send it to anyone who would like to see it to try to explain what Rabeinu Bachya is talking about. That's a particular interesting gem, but there's lots of these throughout. Again, but if you're already used to studying Rashi and the Ramban, Ibn Ezra, and all the other Midrashim, what I'd recommend is to look carefully how he quotes it, because sometimes he adds so much just by adding a word or two. And again, if you're not looking to go through the comments, just to get a kind of what is the playing field? What do people say about it? What does Chazal say about this? You can get so much by reading more about it. You can know what everyone's going to say in their shirim already. You can know what all the Mefarshim are going to say just by reading one of his commentaries.
It's basically be medayik like you would learn a regular Rishon. You really be medactic in what he's saying, but here especially as like you're saying, as he edited what each medrash, what he tweaked or changed. Okay, right. Now let's talk about his other seforim. There's another volume called Kisvei Rabeinu Bachya from Osada of Cook, also edited by Rabbi Shel, and this one has 3 seforim from him. Right, I think it's 3. And this is what we really trust, something that you're working on. First is HaKemach, which is his drashos, his sermons, and then there's his Pirkei Avos and the small sefer called Shel Arba. So let's first focus on HaKemach, the biggest work in there, and is this big other work, I guess, that people probably aren't very familiar with at all.
Yeah, the HaKemach, as I mentioned, is very close to my heart. The HaKemach is a collection of drashos organized alphabetically. So, for example, under the letter Aleph, you have entries for Ava, Emuna, Orchim, and Avel. Under Beis, you have Bracha and Bitachon, and Beis Knesses. Under Gimel, you have Gizela, Gaiva, Ger, etc. And there's 60 entries organized this way. It's often called an encyclopedia. In Chevel's abridged translation, which is gettable, was published by Shel, just like Chevel's translation of the Ramban al Torah and the Ksavim. It's called an encyclopedia of Torah thought, or Jewish thought. The problem with the word encyclopedia is I think when people hear the word encyclopedia, they think of Encyclopedia Britannica, or nowadays our generation Wikipedia, where it's going to tell you the basics about something. That is not what the HaKemach is doing. So, for example, on the entry on Hanukkah, if you write an encyclopedia article about Hanukkah, the first thing in a Jewish encyclopedia, you would write Hanukkah, B'chaf Hei, B'kitzlev, maybe you quote the Gemara in Shabbos, right? And you'd explain the whole story of Hanukkah. Rabeinu Bachya never tells you the Hanukkah story in the entry on Hanukkah. That's not what he does. Instead, it's a collection of midrashim, of ideas of drush connected to Hanukkah. And that's what the HaKemach very clearly is. This was meant, as we now call chomer l'drush. Let's say I'm a Rav, and I've got a bris milah coming up, and I want to give a drusha about bris milah, or maybe in a community that's not so makbid on bris milah, and I want to encourage them about the importance of bris milah. And I got a pair of drusha. There's so much out there. So I can take the HaKemach, go under Bays, find bris, and find a medrash about bris, and find a nice idea about bris, and find what the Rambam says about bris, and how Rabeinu Bachya weaves it all together in a very sermonic style. So sometimes the entries, I remember I had a friend in yeshiva who was trying to read HaKemach, and he said it's very hard to get through. It's not intended necessarily that every drasha is a cohesive piece from beginning to end. Often it is. But sometimes he jumps topics in the middle. Because the goal was to provide something for darshanim. Again, we call this chomer l'drush nowadays, was to provide darshanim with material from which they could use to darshan. Why would such a work come out? I mentioned alphabetical organized works is incredibly rare among Jewish works. There are very few outside of the realm of dictionaries. The Aruch, of course, being a famous one, it is very rare to find alphabetical organization. What's the problem with alphabetical organization? Well, you lose what we call hierarchy. If you take a contrast to work like the Mor Nevuchim, a very clearly structured work where the Rambam is building upon what he says earlier to move to later, and you're not supposed to read the Rambam out of order as many people like to do to get to the fun stuff at the end. You're supposed to read a Keseder because the Rambam's building upon something. When you have a work, you want people to read it in order. When you put something in the order of the Aleph Beis, there's nothing. Obviously, the kedusha of the letters and everything else, but the letter Beis come from the letter Gimel is not itself in order. That's something that you're doing for user-friendly sake. So you lose hierarchy. So many people are uncomfortable with alphabetical organization. What it offers, we would call user-friendliness. And that's what was more important to Rabeinu Bachya was trying to accomplish. To be clear, this is something that strikes people sometimes. It is not strict alphabetical organization within the letter. So, for example, I mentioned under Aleph, if you're going strictly alphabetical, it would go Avel first, because Aleph Beis. That is not how we organize. So within a letter, it does not keep to strict alphabetical organization. That was not the standard nowadays. He also may have not wanted to start the work with Avel. He'd rather start talking about Emunah. But within the letters, he doesn't keep strict. But overall, it is alphabetically organized. Why would such a work come out now? There's a lot of discussion about the history of the drasha, of the sermon. We don't know a lot about what drushos look like in the medieval period, the period of the Rishonim. A couple weeks ago, we were talking about earlier, you had about the drasha Saran, right? We don't really know if the Ran gave these drushos publicly. There are indications because he throws in some lines that he's talking to people, but we don't really know. A very simple question that we cannot answer. A very straightforward question. Assuming Rabbanim were giving drushos, the Ran, the Ramban, Rabeinu Bachya, what language were they giving him? The evidence that the average person was fluent in Hebrew to understand a drasha is very, very weak. Of course, the Rabbanim would write seforim and they'd write tshuvas to each other in rabbinic Hebrew. But the average, and people may have understood davening, but the average person could follow a drasha in rabbinic Hebrew. It is very, very weak. To me, it is very unlikely. So even if these were based on drasha that were given, it's certainly not written down. Number one, if the drasha was given on Shabbos, it's very unlikely. Of course, no one was writing down. And it's unlike these were speech notes also. And I think it's wrong to look at drashos that we have from the Ran, from the Ramban, from Rabbi Bachya, and see them, we can recreate, this must have been the quality and the level and the type of drasha that was being given to the community. I don't think that's correct. The drasha is a genre. It's a style. and that they took ideas that they were giving perhaps in their shuls, but turned into an essay format. That's certainly the way to read, I think, in my opinion, to read the Joshua Saran and the Joshua the Ramban. Rabeinu Bachya was trying something a little bit different. He was providing ideas that could be used in a drasha. Maybe he used them in drashos himself, but that's not what the work was supposed to be. Even though he includes a whole section of what called rishus, where we're asking permission to the shul. Right? It's kind of saying, I'm asking permission of all those given here, of all the great men and great people here. I'm now going to talk on this topic. I'm asking permission. He includes many of those. Were those ones he gave in shul? It's certainly possible. I should also mention in Hakdama, he refers to the work as karban sifasai, a offering of my lips, which sounds like something that he did give, but it's unlikely this was the exact format in which he spoke. And it is wrong, I think, to view it that way. Instead, it should be viewed again as chomer l'drush. Why now? The drasha was gaining in importance, partly because the Jewish community, particularly in Spain, was under assault from the Christian church for trying to get them to convert, particularly through the conversionary sermon. Numerous kings of Spain, leaders of Spain, had passed edicts that the Jews had to listen to conversionary sermons. People may know at the end of the Ramban's Vikuach, of disputation, he mentioned that the king of Spain came to shul and all the Jews had to be there and gave a sermon about certain Christian ideas. And the Ramban responded accordingly. This was a common occurrence, not necessarily with the king, but that the Jews had to let the Christians into their shuls to preach to them. And we know actually in Italy, an edict was passed that there would be guards going around hitting people in case they fell asleep during the drasha, that they had to be woken from their slumber. They had to be listening to conversionary sermons. Jumping forward, this is much after Rabeinu Bachya, right before 1391, which I think you've had a podcast about once upon a time, I think earlier, or something about that, or people post that time period. We know this was happening left and right. The Jews were regularly being forced to hear conversionary sermons. And I think that's why the drasha began to take on a new life of its own among Jews. If the Christians are giving us sermons, particularly Dominicans, which have put a lot of time into understanding Jewish ideas, and bringing them into their sermons, then Rabbanim have to respond accordingly, strengthen his faith. Rabeinu Bachya, in his entry on Pesach, specifically refers to these drashos that were being given in shuls. He mentions, and I know he's talking about certain nevuos in Yeshaya, the suffering servant, and he says, I know what the Christians are telling you what this is about. I'm going to tell you what it's really about. And this is why the drasha began to take on such significance. And if we can add one more layer to that, one of the ways that the Christian sermon had become so dominant for Christians was through the creation of preaching aids and preaching guides, specifically alphabetically organized ones. Now, a lot of the early encyclopedic works among the Christians were meant to take a lot of what the Christian commentaries and church fathers were saying and to put them into an organized book that therefore a Dominican or a priest could take out this book and easily find what to give a sermon about. And there were ones written specifically to preach to Jews. I think Rabeinu Bachya, I don't know, did he see one of these? Was he aware of them? I cannot say. But certainly that's what was going on during this time period, and to create a work like what the HaKemach is, so Rabbanim could give drashas of strengthening the faith of the Jewish constituent, the Jewish people there. That's, I think, how the HaKemach should be read. And post Rabeinu Bachya, before Rabeinu Bachya, we don't really have too many drashos a la parsha. There's Malam Talmidim of Yaakov Anatoli, and maybe a couple other ones you can find. Post Rabeinu Bachya, you suddenly have tons of drashos being published. Even Schwab, who I mentioned earlier, and a couple other ones that are being Yaakov Sicily, and tons of other drashos start coming out post the Kad, often quoting from the Kad, sometimes not by name, and that's, I think, was its real influence, was helping the drasha become stronger.
So first of all, you mentioned the podcast in 1391, the riots in Castile. I did record a podcast. I don't know when this one will come out, but I didn't post that one yet. It's a very lengthy one. That's a very unfortunately important, infamous, period, part of Jewish history. People are familiar with 1492, but really 1391 was when that was like the beginning and the end. So that's important to talk about. So essentially, HaKemach. So we talked about this before. There's in the Mosada of Cook edition. It's in it also. There's a Mishar has an edition. I don't know if it's around anymore. But basically, what you're saying is it's not exactly a sefer someone would just pick up and decide to learn through as a Musar sefer tomorrow.
I don't think so because, again, not all the entries read so well from beginning to end. But if you do have to give a drush on a given topic, or you are curious about ideas, certainly you can find good stuff there. I know in Rav Asher Weiss's Sefer on Amuna that came out not long ago, he quotes certain ideas from it. Again, the article Sitter here and there quotes some ideas from the HaKemach. You can find amazing ideas in there about the foundations of why we do certain things. For example, his entry on Sukkos, he talks about why we go around the bima 7 times on Hoshana Rabbah, and so he mentions 5 different reasons why we do this. One of them is because we're calling Kadosh Baruch Hu's rage upon the world. That just like he brought down the walls of Yericho, we should bring down our enemies. Those walls also should come down. But again, he quotes a lot of very interesting ideas, some of which you probably have heard, but maybe have become popularized to the Qad, but often ones that people may not be as familiar with. Ideas of faith. And again, on the Yom Tovim, most of the entries are either about articles of Emunah or about the Yom Tovim or particular mitzvahs. I guess I should mention in his entry about Gezel Hamas, that's stealing the tax. The Jewish community back then was taxed based on the community, and so people who hid their status community or didn't pay would mean that other people had to pay their amount for taxes, and he very much criticizes people who kind of involved in this kind of theft. Particularly, again, one whole entry on that. I should also mention, again, I've written about this as well, in his entry on ger, on a convert. He mostly he says a ger is anyone who doesn't have a home. Any Jew doesn't have a home is a ger. And again, this is probably speaking to the fact that many Jews were coming to Spain without homes and needed to be protected and taken care of, financially and otherwise. So again, you can certainly see some of the current events that were going on during that time period.
Okay, now his last 2 seforim, which are also included in the Kisser Rabeinu Bachya, Shel, Musar of Cook, are a small sefer called Shulchan Shel Arba, an interesting work. Talk about it in the Pirkei Avos. And the Pirkei Avos is a commentary on Pirkei Avos that's included in the. It's not called Teres Chaim. What's it called? The Musar of Cook.
Musar of Pirkei Avos. I forgot also what it's called, but it looks
I'm forgetting what it's called. I'll try to find it while I talk here. But talk a little bit about Shulchan Shel Arba and then about the Pirkei Avos.
Shulchan Shel Arba is one of the most unique, if you can say most unique, Jewish works from the Rishonim. It is a Shulchan Shel Arba table of 4. It's got 4 sections to it of different aspects of eating. I should mention there is a partial translation, a free translation of this work online, done by Jonathan Bloomberg Krauss, a scholar here in America, with I think some artwork from one of his students. So if you want to see it in English, again, it's a free translation, so it's not word for word, but you can Google. I can send you the link after you want to read it. But again, it is in the Shel edition. There are 4 sections. The first where he talked about hilchos, eating, the halachos of brachos. This is quoted twice in the Beis Yosef, and I think 2 or more 3 times in the Darkei Moshe, the commentary on the Torah. His halachic opinions are cited about eating. And then the second is what your ideals of eating. What is the point of eating? What should our kavanas of eating be? That's kind of the second section. The third is proper manners, proper etiquette, which based on some Gemaras, people know the Gemaras describes how a person's supposed to eat. And the 4th section is more Kabbalistically oriented about the Suda at the end of days. What's going to be at the Suda Shel Yasan, and what are people going to eat? What's going to look like when it's Tchias HaMesim? There's been the lion's share of the scholarship on Rabeinu Bachya has, to me, been almost ironically about Shulchan Shel Arba. There's been a number of articles that have come out about Rabeinu Bachya's ideas of eating and what eating accomplishes and how we're supposed to view eating. Rabeinu Bachya writes in Hakdama, it's intended to be something that you'll have at your table. That you'll read you're eating right now, and you want, let's look up and see. After this halacha of eating, and this is what I'm supposed to do, and these should be my kavanos about eating. It's a very, very strange work. It's hard to know when it was written because there's no real great proof in one way or the other. It is Rabeinu Bachya's style in the sense that it's malakit 4 different approaches. You can almost see a very nice parallel between his commentary on the Torah, where he brings 4 different approaches to how to study the Torah, and Shulchan Shel Arba, which are 4 different approaches of how to eat. And as an anthologizer and collector, again, quoting Midrashim and everything else, it certainly fits into his other works. But it's somewhat of a strange work. It doesn't, and we know the Ritva wrote a Hilchos Brachos, which is printed as part of the Musar of Cook edition. That reads like a regular halacha book. This is very, very different again, just because that style where it's a mix of halacha and practical, and he tells you how you should eat, how you should sit, and what you're thinking about, and again, what the end of days is going to be like. It was also incredibly popular. Was among, again, I mentioned earlier, the libraries of the Jews that we know about. Sometimes we know about the libraries because the Christians confiscated books. We know they made a listing of what seforim they found. Also incredibly popular in the age of print, the early age of print, printed relatively early, and again, very commonly quoted from, again, halacha and his other ideas. So again, the main, I think, yeah.
And it was mistakenly attributed to Ramban, right? That was something.
It was at one point, I think, mistakenly attributed to Ramban. I will mention, I know one person who is not convinced it was written by Rabeinu Bachya, but not sure. There are some contradictions between Rabeinu Bachya, between the Shulchan Shel Arba and the commentary on the Torah, particularly about his view of whether there will be food at the end of days, whether the tzaddikim will actually be eating. Will we be eating physical food at Tchias HaMesim? Will there be physical food or not? He says one way in the commentary on the Torah, and totally the parallel opposite in the Shulchan Shel Arba. Now, it could be he changed his mind. It could be, I want to be clear, it could be this what he thought when he was younger and older. It could be he changed his mind. There are a couple other weird contradictions between the works, which is at least the question that how well do we know that he wrote this? There aren't, as opposed to the HaKemach, where he very often quotes his commentary on the Torah, and very much the works stem together. Shulchan Shel Arba is kind of outside. But again, certainly Stanley consensus that was written by Rabeinu Bachya, I'm not sure. The Shel edition, I think, is really the only edition that you can really get it nowadays. And again, there's this English translation online. Shel did a very nice job with the sources and some of the biurim. Again, it's very readable. It was intended to be popular. I should be clear. It's not written on a high level only for philosophers or people. It was written for the hamonam. It was written for the regular person who knew how to read Hebrew, who knew how to learn. So if you're looking at it, you can go through it relatively quickly and pick up some very interesting ideas.
Right. Now, the last sefer of his is the Pirkei Avos, which the Mosad of Cook is Mishnas Ruvain, is what it's called. Pirkei Avos. It's in there, and it's in the Kis Rabeinu Bachya. So, talk about a little bit about his Pirkei Avos and how did it differ? What was different or interesting about that versus a standard commentary on Pirkei Avos, if there is a standard commentary on Pirkei Avos?
Yeah. It is again more like your standard commentary in the sense that he goes Mishnah by Mishnah. And explains each line. Again, we don't know exactly when it was written. Chevelle assumes it was written later in life because there's a couple of proofs to that. But again, he goes Mishnah by Mishnah, relies heavily on some of the early commentaries of Rashi and some of the others. Has a lengthy Hakdama where he explains the first Mishnah. And again, like his other works, he quotes the Rambam, the Perush Mishnayos, on the Shemona Prakim rather. He quotes Rashi, he quotes the Rabbeinu Yonah. He quotes a lot of the standard commentaries, but then kind of adds his own little piece there. So again, that same style where he'll quote what came before him and adds his own little knach, his own little idea, particularly I think on the opening one of what Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai means. He also quotes from Machzor Vitri all over. Again, this, as I said earlier, this is very much Rabeinu Bachya's style as a malaket, but again, carefully edited and adding in his own chidushim along the way. It's not long commentary, so if you're looking for something that just kind of gets you through the Mishnah, just kind of the main ideas, his commentary is very, very, again, incredibly readable. And this goes for everything Rabeinu Bachya wrote. Well, I mentioned earlier, his commentary does require some careful reading. He was not speaking to the elite. He wanted this to be a readable, learnable sefer for the Hamonam. Rabeinu Bachya does not write, except when he's quoting Kabbalah, does not write in highfalutin language. He was not an elitist. He wanted his commentary to be popular, and again, part of his, in that sense, his Kosh Baruch Hu gave him that bracha that his work, as much of history, was incredibly was well read and popular.
Okay, and I think we've mentioned all the different editions throughout, and if I find links, I can try to link. If not, people can email me. We can try. But the Masada of Cook stuff is still available. The Kisvei and the Pirush Shel Torah is widely available. Same for the Izvahadar one. Now go to Izvahadar's website, or it's widely available. Whatever they did. And the Mir one that maybe is available, maybe not. I know that's a complete set. And then the HaKemach Misha, I don't think is available. You also, one last thing about the HaKemach Misha, you mentioned to me there's something about his grave. There's pictures of graves in there. It talks about where he's buried. There's something interesting tidbit you wanted to mention. Yeah,
there are two matzevas, or two burial places in Israel nowadays. One of them is in is somewhere, I think, in the Galil. And I cannot recall where the other one is. These were revealed much later. We don't have evidence that he ever went to Eretz Yisrael at any point. He was probably buried in Spain. Again, as with everything else, there's always a possibility that this one of the Kfarim is really Bachim Bekuda, or was mistakenly revealed as Bachim Bekuda and got mixed up with him. But there are two places in Eretz Yisrael. Again, one of the I can't remember where the other one is right now, where you can go to, and that is a matzeva of his. The other thing I guess I'll just mention, and I mentioned earlier, there is a Kitzer version of the HaKemach that was not published. It was written by Shem Tov ibn Shaprut, who was one of the lived about a few generations after Rabeinu Bachya. He wrote what's called the Mania Hakad. It is a Kitzer, an abridged version of the HaKemach. Not been published, but available in a very readable manuscript online. Some of the chapters were published by Dov Schwartz in an article. He wrote a whole book about Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut, and he has a chapter on this called The Work of the Miniakad. Schwartz writes at the beginning, this is the only Kitzer version that he's aware of, the only abridgment where the person doing the abridging, and that's it, did not have respect for his author, meaning for who he was abridging. Meaning, usually writing a Kitzer is you think it's an amazing work, and you write a Kitzer because you want an easier version of it. So Dov Schwartz writes here, he doesn't really care for the HaKemach as a work. He thinks the drush in there is not particularly good, but it's a good style. It's a good format. And I assume he means the alphabetical format. Schwartz, that may be a slight exaggeration, but certainly Shapur edited stuff out. He added a couple chapters of his own on more philosophical ideas, including Yichud Hashem, and a few other ideas, the chapters that he added, again, more philosophically inclined, where he, again, the fact that he saw the alphabetical organization as a system to be used that could spread Jewish in other places, I think it's just fascinating that he was really Mikatzer, the style of Rabeinu Bachya, not the work itself. So that's just, I think it's probably worth mentioning as well in that volume.
Yeah, it's a small volume, Kisvei, Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut, but Dov Schwartz by Idra, published by Idra Publishing. So basically, Rabeinu Bachya, if someone wants to read more, is there any articles, books, anything, where would you direct someone who wants to read more about him?
Yeah, there's not so much scholarship out there in either Hebrew or English. There is a lot on his Kabbalah. There's a lot to out there. Kabbalah, I mentioned earlier, Ephraim Gottlieb has a book which is not really gettable, but if you're near a library, they have it, called HaKabbalah, and he has many articles, HaKabbalah B'Kisvei Rabeinu Bachya, but not sure interested in the Kabbalah aspects. And then there's been a number of articles. Jonathan Bloomberg Krauss has written a number of articles related to eating. And Adam Apterman, Idan Pinto, have written a couple of articles related to his Kabbalah, specifically about eating. Again, those articles are available wherever you get academic articles. And then the Hakdama, the introduction to a lot of the seforim that we've been mentioning, often have some interesting tidbits and factoids about him. And then hopefully, one day my dissertation will be available to be read. I guess I'm plugging myself here. Again, not yet, but one day.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to that. And, thank you for discussing Rabeinu Bachya or Bachya, whatever people want to refer to him as. And hopefully we're able to enlighten the audience a little bit more about him and his life and his works.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.